That's fine. Great. Mic is working, camera working, notes working. Great. So, hello everyone. I hope you all are doing fine. And as you know, we have started this crack UGC Net English course, and last two classes were really fruitful. We discussed a lot of things, especially the PYQs, and also there are like not so much, so many pages of notes, but very small notes. From that they ask question. You don't need to go and read big history books and all, and occupy yourself, and they take a lot of time, and if you have a lot of time you can go through it. Otherwise these notes are enough for you. Right, so let's begin. Today we are talking about Module 3, Middle English Period. Chaucer and his contemporaries. So, Chaucer and his contemporaries, that we'll discuss tomorrow, not today, because Chaucer, little bit too much is there to select which kind of questions they ask, what kind of point shall I mention. Anyway, the notes already kind of I made it, I compiled it according to PYQs, and whatever the question they asked in the past, it's there. But today we are only focusing on Middle English period. We'll just talk about the introduction and the history, what kind of language was there, and what kind of style was trending at that time. All these things we'll talk about today itself. So I hope you all are doing fine, and let's begin then. So as you can see over your screen, what we have, I want to mention one thing. When you prepare your you know this particular subject English, you should consider around 10 to 15 points, and that's very important. It applies everywhere. It can, these points are important when you discuss about the age, when you read about author or poet or their works or their styles. Everything has these points that I'm telling you. So as you see, suppose we are talking about some age. So here we are taking example of Middle English. What you should consider when you start preparing, when you start reading books or your notes. The first thing is very important, that you should know about the language. That's why is there, it's there in your syllabus, like language and linguistic. Why it is important in English literature? Because that shows the improvement over time, over period, improvement in language. So that thing. And we also talked about in last class, that is called what? Diachronic, study of the language through the time. That you should remember, and they ask question, you know these, and this is also important in your linguistic section, right? So as we are moving forward through this age Middle English, we should first focus on these points. As I told you, first is the language, and what kind of question you should ask when you talk about language, whatever you are preparing. Like, in which language did author or poet wrote? Did he write in Old English or Middle English, or did he write in Latin or in French? So these language you should consider, right? And what did they contribute to or influence the development of a specific dialect? That is also important, because some of the author, they develop their own style, their own dialect, like their vernacular language, all these things, like northern, midland, and southern. These things you should consider. You jump into any work, right? And then you should consider, when you are you know talking about somebody's work or some poet's poem, that what style did he write, what kind of poem he's writing. So that kind of features of this, they distinct feature of their writing style, like did they use alliteration or did they use rhyme or allegory, or did they use kenning or you know all other forms, right? That you should ask. And how does their style reflect in literary trends? Very important. And as for example, when we were discussing about old English, we talked about that most of the time they were using this method, alliteration, right? But this time what happened is little bit, and now we are in development of rhyme. Very important, right? And how does that was all about style. Now one more point that you should consider, that the form, which form the poem is written. Is it in sonnet, or is it in prose, or drama, or narrative poetry? Very important. And what kind of innovation, or they invented or they innovate in particular genre, what kind of things they introduced in that genre, right? Or did they innovate new genre or something like gothic fiction, right? That those things that you should consider. Then very important, date. So these points that I'm mentioning here, why we are discussing right now, because when we move forward from Chaucer to other poets, and rather through the ages, we have to consider all these points, because these are the points that you have possibilities that they'll ask a question based on that, not something different from these points. You're not going to get any question out of from these points. So everything is there on these points, so that you should consider. So when we talk about any work in our class, we'll consider all these 14 to 15 points. And that's that's the way we'll make notes. And that you should also create and make your own notes, right? And then we talk about dates. Dates are very important in UGC net. They ask a question, especially in order, or their chronology order, all this stuff. So you should remember the date and date of their first and last known work. Very important. When you talk about any author or poet, you should first remember its first work and the last work, because in chronology order, if you know these two, you are able to answer the question, right? And how do their works align with the literary period? Quite important. And then influence. When we talk about fifth point here, in any particular work, age, or style, anything, what influence, who or what influenced their writing, like some historical events, like peasant revolt, or you know Black Death, all these stuff. So these events are very important, that they influence their particular work. And how did they influence later authors, and what is the significance contribution of this particular author that influenced the other authors, later authors, writer, or any literary movement. And the first work and last work, always remember, very important, that these you should get. Any author you're discussing or reading about, these two things you should consider. Then chronology, that kind of question in net they ask, right? And like 10 to 15 questions you get in your exam about the chronology. So in that perspective, this chronology is like a must for you to consider when you're discussing, or when you're reading, or you're preparing notes on any particular poets or authors. So major works in chronological order. What important events or movements were happening during their lifetime? That is also very important. And another, the ninth point is translation. Like any particular writer or poet you're talking about, you should consider, did they translate any work, or if so, from which language, right? And have their works, or their works has been translated into other language by somebody else, that is also quite important in net they ask. And important lines and quotation, this is very important that you should consider in particular work, right? Notable quotation that we are also covering in our notes. And types of poem, very important. What kind of poems is this? Is it epic we are talking about, or elegy we are talking about, or is it romance? This is very important. And about their work, is they works more about religion or secular, secular or political or philosophical. Very important that you should consider this point while preparing any work. And geographical maps, quite important, especially in the beginning when we start from middle English. We should always think about those maps, right? Like here is our middle English midland, here is northern, right? And here is southern. So these part you should consider, and where these author belongs, that I'll tell you. Because if suppose Chaucer is from the middle, so he would write in middle language, right? His dialect would be affected because he's in the middle. So that influenced his writing, and it can be seen, these dialects can be seen in his work. And if it is Chaucer, he won't write in another dialect, right? It's completely far. So that kind of thing is very important when we talk about. That's how you'll recognize actually which language or which dialect they particular belong with. Sometime it might be in match the following, and they might ask question that, and they have asked previously. That's why these point that point that I have mentioned here is quite important. Then the dialect, it's kind of the same. um, which dialect English did they write? Is it in northern, midland, or southern? These kind of example. And how did their use of dialect contributed to literary diversity? So these dialogues like Cockney is there, and like vernacular in particular areas or region that they're talking about. So these things you should consider when you prepare your things. Then very important, literary categories. Category is very important. Is it the romantic period, or metaphysical, or modernist, or gothic, or suspense, or thriller, or science fiction? This category that you should always remember, or you know keep in mind while preparing any author. Then critical overview, very important. Sometimes we only focus on the strength of particular poet or particular author, but in your exam they ask like their weakness. Like there is one sentence, one work, right, about Matthew Arnold. He was talking about in study of poetry, and he talked that Chaucer lacked what? He didn't have what? Seriousness, high seriousness. He didn't have in his work. So these kind of that thing he's lacking in it. So these things you should consider, and there is strength, of course, you should consider. And thinking and religious views, and what is their thinking, what is their personal belief or religious views when they were writing particular work, so that you can also see. And how did these views influence their writing and themes? Very important. So these 16 points, if you consider, if you keep in mind while preparing all, then your net is clear. You have the category to divide all these stuff, and that will fit in your brain, right? So before we go to our middle English period, I would mention some event. So these events, you see, are very important in you know that lit in middle English literature, especially literature part. The great famine, right? Then we have the black death, and this is important for chronology order. So these order you should remember. The first thing came is the great famine, and it was 1315 to 1317. First large scale crisis of 14th century, affecting most of Europe, caused by bad weather, crop failure, leading to mass death, disease, and crime. And how many, how long it went, resulted decline of population that lasted until 1322. Then we have another major, that is our Black Death. What happened there? Remember, 20 to 30 million across Europe died, and it came from Asia, carried by rats through the trade route, that sea trade route, and killed between 30 to 50% of the population. That's kind of a lot, and leading shortage of farmers, right? And took 200 years for the population of Europe to recover from this massive event. Date: Great Famine 1315, and 1347 Black Death lasts till 1352. Very important. We can create a code for this also, like uh, we can just make like this: first code F A, then B L A, flabla fabla, kind of these kind of note. Anyway, at the end of the session, I'll just create some, mnemonic for you to remember the events also. Remember: Great Famine, Black Death, 100 Years War. So basically it started in 1330. You can just put 100, and it'll be 1453 plus 20 more years, right? 16, 17. Anyway, remember that 100 years war, it was the third major event, and it was conflict between two great houses, England and France, over the French crown and control of the territories. A notable battle: Cersei, Poitiers, and Agnicourt. That you should remember this one only. And French victory with the help of figure like Joan of Arc, leading to the eventual control of French except for Calais. ठीक है, Calais. Then we have peasant revolt. Remember 1381. This is very important date that you get always in exam. Right, this one. And what is this peasant revolt? When this Black Death happened, no, many of farmers were, not there, and also England got very, poor at that time, and they put high taxes from the 100 Years War, and led by what, this particular important figure, who is Wat Tyler, supported by radical cleric John Ball. These two figures that you should remember, resulting in a mass protest and demands for the abolition and serfdom. So remember these two figures: Wat Tyler, John Ball, in peasant revolt, which happened in 1381. Rebels attacked London and secured concession from King Richard II before the revolt. So is these things are important because in your chronology they ask a question. Then we have fall of, Constantinople, and this is what, 1453. This is about end of Byzantine Empire after the Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II, and the fall allowed Ottoman expansion into Eastern Europe, and a major stronghold on Christian Europe. That you should remember. Remember the date 1453. So then invention of printing. Everybody knows it, and came from China, and woodlock printing and movable type was invented by Bi Sheng in 11th century. Through woodlock printing was more widely used. The technology spread in Korea and Europe, and revolutionized what, book production, right? So that was this thing. Then we have important that actually comes in Tudor period, which is wars of the roses that you should know. Two great houses. What? Lancaster Red House and York White House. These days they don't ask question based on that, but you should have a general idea that the House of Lancaster belonged to the Red House and York belonged to the White House. Over what they were fighting over? English throne. And key battle over there: St Albans, Battle of Taunton, Battle of Bosworth Field. The conflict ended with what? The rise of Tudor dynasty after the victory of Henry Tudor or Henry VII at Bosworth Field. These are the battles that you should remember. This one, St. Albans, and there is one more that is called Taunton. These two battles are important that you should just have an idea. They're not going to ask anything but for your general idea, because imagine that there was some war in wars of the roses. There were two houses and there were some battles between them, and who won at the end is what? Tudor dynasty in England. That's what you have to remember. Others you can just skip it. Right. And when we talked about these events that influenced literature, Middle English, and after that, we should also consider which were the kind of neighboring countries, writer or poet influenced English, because at that time, as you know, French was dominating and English was kind of starting from Chaucer, right? So these poets from other country, from neighboring country like Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, they influenced England, and most of the poet wrote based on that. They adapted their style also. They adapted their plots and the story or the allegory, all these stuff they took. So we'll just have a brief introduction. They just ask, don't so not so many stuff, but just their work. In Dante allegory you get only what kind of question about the divine comedy. That's what you get always. And in that, and the question is about chronology. So what you should know: who is Dante Alighieri and how he influenced English writer. That you should consider only. So birth you should know: 1265. Family, notable family of modest means. His mother died when he was 7 after his father remarried. These things you don't have to remember, right? Love and inspiration, betrayed to, this is very important, Beatrice, because most of his work is influenced by this muse, right? Lifelong muse, Beatrice, who inspired his poetry, La Vita Nova, which is the new life. And remember why he was famous: because he was, you know, uh, influenced by vernacular influence, was, there in his work. Established the use of vernacular in simple Tuscan dialect. They might change when they ask, question. Literature breaking away from the dominance of Latin. So French was completely dominated by Latin at that time, and to trend it, what Dante took what use of vernacular language, and he actually walks away from the Latin, right? And his works helped from standardized Italian language. So Dante was actually uh, standardized that language, Italian, not French. I think I mentioned French in between. That is not there, right? And literary legacy, instrumental in the development of Italian literature. Influenced who? Chaucer, Milton, Alfred Tennyson, and very important that he introduced what? Terzarima. Very important that you should know. And this is what terza means: three. This means three. So 3 line rhyme scheme, because the rhyma is also written, so you can just mention Okay, and consider him as the father of Italian language and one of three crowns, as we know, Petrarch, Boccaccio, and our Dante himself. And Divine Comedy, that in Italian title it is La Commedia, or later known as the Divine Comedy. Date of composition 1308 to 1321. Structure, what it has three parts divided into three sections: Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. What theme is his journey from his spiritual darkness to divine enlightenment? Guides, who other characters were there? Virgil and Beatrice. Beatrice, as you know, his muse, right? Lifelong beloved. An allegory, it uses the allegory of soul's journey. So in Inferno, what happens through the through the name, you can just understand it's about hell. And here he was guided by Virgil. Structure: hell consists nine concentric circle and of increasing torment. Symbolism represent those who have rejected spiritual values and committed violence, fraud. Another part is purgatorio, and this is what it is also guided by Virgil and later by who? His beloved Beatrice. Theme: patient of Christian life, sin, vice, virtue. Symbolism represent a moral journey of purification. So purgatorio means itself is a purification, and paradiso, it's about heaven, and guided by who? Beatrice alone. And symbolism represents soul's ascent to God. So what you have to remember in Dante, we just discussed a little bit inside that he wrote Divine Comedy, introduced Terza influenced Chaucer and John Milton, and what standardized Italian language, use of vernacular, and this Terza you should definitely remember. Right, and it has three parts, all are divided by nine circles, right? Three, yes, nine circles. So that you should, and then we have Boccaccio. In Boccaccio, you should remember that we know him because he influenced who? Our Chaucer. So, Italian poet and writer known for realistic dialogue, promoter of vernacular language alongside with Dante and Petrarch. Same is that Tuscan vernacular. Scholar and classicist, shifted toward classical studies and Latin works, writing in what? Roman and Greek mythology. Notable work, you should know only one, the Decameron, 1353. And what is it? Has 100 tales and a collection of biographies about historical women. This is another work. And if we just talk about Decameron, what happens? Remember, he also influenced Chaucer and English literature as well as this. Then we have Decameron, a little bit about more about it, but you should know just the name and what a, this work influenced which work. That's all. So likely written in what? Black Death, 100 stories, total 10 characters, 7 women, 3 men, 10 days. So that you should know. Each day, one character becomes a queen or a queen and assign a theme for days' stories, except for two free topic delays. Right? Themes: what? Love there, fortune, human will, clever replies, tricks, female ambition, and mockery of clergy. Innovative structure, as we know, Boccaccio used what? Frame narrative. And recurring motifs, lust, ambition, greed, clergy, Italian. Not so important. And literary importance, masterpiece of classical Italian prose. So what you have to remember in Boccaccio, that he has written Decameron. He wrote in vernacular. He wrote in vernacular language, and he used frame narrative, influenced Chaucer, Cervantes, and Decameron has 100 stories, 10 character, 3 men, and 10 days. One character becomes king or queen and assign them to tell a tale according to the theme. Right? That's all you have to remember, not more than that. And Francis Petrarch, remember the date, 1304 to 1374. Of course, born in Italy, background son of Sir Petrarco, education he studied law and shift to literature, abandoned law after his father's death. Laura and the Canzonier, very famous work that you should know. Encounter with Laura, met with Laura, so based on that he got the Canzonier, very important. 366 poems, 3 17 sonnets centered around his love for Laura. Written between date, remember 1327, 1368. Again, vernacular. So these vernacular thing they influenced, Chaucer to write in his, Midland local dialect. Right, so that is all about Dante and why we know Petrarch. And why we know about Petrarch is Petrarchian sonnet, popularizing the sonnet format. Right, and what else should we know? That's enough about humanism that we should know. This contribution in humanism, very important, and the Renaissance. Right, then we have, now we are moving to our main topic, and which is Middle English. As you see over your screen, this map, you know, when you see that from here, Chaucer is do two parts, right? And here is, I think, cover. So these are the dialect that at that time it was they were using. Then we have southern, Kentish, East Midland, West Midland. We'll know through that. So northern dialect is there. None of the famous poets are there. So not basically you have to remember from this some political poems and about some other religion epic were written in northern dialect, like the Cursor Mundi. It was in Northumbrian or northern dialect, very important. Then Midland dialect, where most of our famous poets are: Chaucer, William Langland, and Gawain poet, who we know as a pearl poet, right? So that you should know. Then we have southern dialect. Southern dialect is where you see here, from here, which particular author is John Gower. Gower and Lemon. Lemon's Brute. Middle English poem, southern dialect. Confessio Amantis, southern dialect. Right, and the Middle English period, now we will focus deeply what happened there and how many you know wars and what influenced, what kind of dialect, what kind of poetic model or style, that we'll discuss. So the Middle English, remember, they don't ask much question, they only ask about, sometime they're asking about chronology, and they will ask about basically Chaucer. That Chaucer we'll discuss in our next chapter. next lesson. And here we are just considering the build up of the language, mostly about the dialects and their style and form. So in this period, that is important, not particular writer or author, but just the origin of these things, right? So the Middle English period, what Norman and Angevin dynasty, marked by the establishment of excuse me, class struggles, ongoing conflict between kings, noble, clergy, common people. So many wars were happening against France, Scotland, Wales. Language shift, Old English disappears, giving a way to Anglo French or Middle English, which evolved into modern English. French influence significant influx French word. Mostly, Middle English has French words. And these dialects we have already discussed northern, midland, southern. Northern through north upside, middle in the between, and south is in that side. Right. So that you should know. Then poetic models, as we know, they all got influenced by French, Latin, and alliteration, as we have discussed, the repetition. It was used in Old English in our previous class, but this time there was kind of some re-emergence in that particular form. And in this period that we are talking in English, that Middle English, that they started what, a rhyme. So basically everything about rhyme royal, rhyme scheme, tarza rema, all these things got in the Middle English. And in Old English, alliteration, canning, and kesura, all these stuff that you should know. And poetry dominance, prose, people were not writing prose at that time. Just couple of works that I'll tell, but not more than. Most of the time, most of poets only were writing poetry, not the prose. Classification of poem, there are three types of, we can just divide that classification of poem by the rhyming chronicles, where you can see Layman's Brute, Robert of Gloucester, Robert Manning, Lawrence Minute. You don't have to remember all this, you just have to have basic idea that the classification of poem had kind of three groups. One was rhyming, everything was in rhyming chronicles. And then we have religious and didactic poem, which one is very important is this, the Owl and the Nightingale, written by, attributed to Nicholas of Guildford. Other works, as you see, Orison of Our Lady, Alfred Provost, all these stuff that you should know. There were poem on religious and didactic poetry. Cursor Mundi is another important religious epic. Then Richard Rolle of Hampole, also notable contemporary poet on religion, and alliterative poems, who wrote very important Pearl poem. Pearl means pearl, cleanness, patient. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Very important. This was written in alliterative. There was one question based on that. These are particular work, which one is not written in, or which one is written in alliterative form. So that was one question there. And metrical romance. So when we talk about metrical romance, we have Kinghorn, Havelock the Dane, Guy of Warwick, Bevis of Hampton. Arthurian romance, that's where you should focus, where we know Morty Arthur, Gawain the Green and the Green Knight. Here you get question on Morty Arthur, that about the Caxton printing. I'll tell you that. And then classical themes, King Alexander, Sir Hero, the destruction of Troy. And Sharmilan, we have romance like a ruffle, career, alliterative romance, all this. Contemporary romance, we have MS William, the Squire of Low Degree, all these stuff. Only you should remember what Mortady Arthur and the Gaylight in Arthurian romance. Prose, there was nothing much in prose in Middle English period. Just very important one is encrine rivalry, rule of enchoresis around 1200, earliest Middle English prose. So you should have basic idea because ki prose was also there at that time, but not you know like poetry. Poetry dominance at that, right. Then development of poetry, as we know, meter developed, and there were kind of lyric poem, then metrical romances there, and then famous chivalric romances in Middle English. So basically you should have some small ideas about it. It's a kind of type of prose or verse narrative which was popular at that time in Europe, and they were focusing about what adventure of heroic knights or quest. So basically what you see, these poems, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Lee Morted Arthur, and Lancelot Green Grail. So in that, what you have to remember, just have some idea that what they are, like King Horn. So you should know the date, 1170, Middle English romance from the 13th century based on Anglo Norman romance of Horn. So this particular King Horn is based on work, right? Short summary is what hero Horn, son of King Elof Sardane, is orphaned by Saracens and later grows up in Brittany. He falls in love with the king's daughter Rigmel and defends the kingdom from invaders. Wrongly accused, Horn is banished to Ireland, where he again proves his heroism but refuses the hand of the king's daughter. Eventually, he returns to Brittany, marrying her. So, basically, this is about hero Horn, who is what orphaned and fall in love with the king's daughter, and he was just doing his duty, like uh, defending the kingdom and all. So basically, simple one adventure of a king is there. Sir Gawain the Green Knight, that you should know the plot about it. Uh, it will help you later in the session. So describe the quest of Sir Gawain, a knight of King Arthur Round Table. So you know, if you have watched couple of series or maybe movie, then you will know the story. So basically, this Green Knight challenges any knight. बोलता है कि if whoever is there who can cut my head off in one blow, just one blow, and then he will take a return blow in a year, after 1 year. So this Gawain beheads the Green Knight, but later picks up his head and reminds Gawain of their agreement. So Gawain honor is tested through his interaction with the lord and the lady of the castle, and this manuscript, that you should know that it was alongside with pearl, cleanness, and patience. All four poems are attributed to Per poet or Gawain poet, written in Northwest Midland dialect. Le Morte d'Arthur is what written by Mallory, very important, published by William Caxton. Content, a compilation of traditional tales about King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, and we have Sir Lancelot and the Knights of the Round Table. So basically, two main characters and some group of knights in the Round Table, and one more, Sir Lancelot. So basically, you should remember these three knights. And Mallory interpreted and adapted existing French and English stories adding original material and with much drawn from late 14th century French. Remember the structure, the story is divided into 21 books. And what happens? The founding of Arthur Kingdom, the creation of Round Table, the Adventure of Night, then we have Holy Grail, Arthur and the Fall of the Kingdom, all these stuff. Right. So basically, you should know the date and why this particular work is important because of this that it was printed by William Caxton. Another thing that you should remember that it influenced, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Themes easy when we talk about adventure. There should be chivalry. There should be some historical context, social criticism, and that's all here. And now we'll talk about William Caxton and the introduction of printing press. Very important because one way or the other you're going to get one question. Maybe they'll ask about Morte Arthur, maybe they'll ask about the history of Troy, maybe they'll ask about Canterbury Tales or the Legends of Women. So these all he has printed, right? So that's why this basically it's very important in literary period. So William Caxton, he introduces printing into London. Remember the date, 1450. Right, and by who? Johanna Gutenberg in Germany. By late 15th century, printed books were available in London through import and from Europe. William Caxton, remember the date, 1422 to 1491, and in 1474 to 75 he printed the first language, very important, the recall of the history of the Troy. This question has come once about the first printed English book, especially on this, so that you should know. Les Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Mallory. Ask, sometime in exam ask why, as I told you about, because William Caxton printed it, and we know about Mallory from who? From William Caxton. So basically that's why it's important. And printing in London in 1476, so that's our date. Returned to England and set up his printing business near Westminster Abbey, and his first printed book is what was Dictates or Swainies of Philosopher, 1477. Publishing business, Caxton not only printed books but also imported them from the continent, covering primarily to merchant in London by 1488. Significance, work and contribution, he actually published around 100 books, including Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the Game and the Plays of Chess. So guys, that's all here, and we have just some questions that we can discuss, which were basically it's all from the past 5 years. They don't ask many questions. We are just having just light discussion, that how, mostly they ask about the dialect and all from this period itself. Chaucer, of course, we'll talk about in our next session. So first question, which two of the following works does Walter Pater regarded as example of the great art? So is it Iliad or Divine Comedy or La Miserables or Faust? According to Walter Pater, great art was in his essay style. He talked about what? Here, the Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, La Miserable, the English Bible. So here we have only two options, La Miserable and the Divine Comedy. So that is answer. Right, these kind of questions they ask, not directly from the period but indirectly. Question 2, again chronology, usually you'll get only this. We already talked about, right, Beowulf yesterday, Old 10th century, right? Somewhere around 10th. Then Divine Comedy, that around 14th century. And Le Morte d'Arthur, same 14th. Canterbury Tales. So that basically you should remember these dates. So when we talk about Chaucer, then it'll be clear. We'll also uh, give you more question to practice from these order. So Beowulf as no 10th century, right? Remember alliterative lines. The Summa Theologia, 13th century, doctor of the church. Dante, 13 not 8 and 1321, 14th century, very important. Geoffrey Chaucer, because as you know, Chaucer was influenced by Dante, right? So basically he will be behind Dante. So our Chaucer wrote Canterbury Tales 1387 to 1400. Le Morte d'Arthur also came very late. I mean, it was published around the same, but it was printed around this time, 1485 by Caxton, and complete. This was completed in 1470. So Le Morte d'Arthur at the end. So these order we have to know. The Voyage and Travel of Sir John Mandeville were written in which language? Northumbria? No, it was in Midland. So the same thing is there. 14th century. Basically little about this work, but what we need to know that it is written in the form of English and known as the Middle dialect. Question 4. Who among the following praised Chaucer's translation of Roman de la Rose? It was Eustace Deschamps who praised Chaucer translation of uh, Roman de la Rose. Question 5. Which one of the following by Ezra Pound defined an image as that which present an intellectual and emotional complex of an instant of time? It was a retrospect. A retrospect. Why did we mention this particular question? Because here he talked about, you see, Dante, Petrarch, Cavallant in the Renaissance in Italy. That's why we have put this question. Which among the following is an incomplete poem by P.B. Shelley? Why P.B. Shelley is there? Because of the triumph of life, and it is based on what? Our Petrarch. He modeled the poem written in terza rima, the same who took our Petrarch, right? Phony and Dante's Divine Comedy. In that specific point of view, this question comes into our in this period, right? So that's why I say always key you should you know what other writer or poet had said about this particular writer or poet, or he's written or employed his style, all these stuff, right? So only that many questions they have asked in 5 years. 5 years means twice exam, so kind of in 10 years you're getting 6 to 7 8 questions more than that you're not getting. So through that you can just understand key what you have to remember. And when we talked about it, mostly the questions were on the dialect, on the form, right, on the chronology order, nothing some deep inside it. In Chaucer they must have asked couple of time before, but right now they're not asking. The trend is gone to go deep into that work and asking about these stuff. You're not going to get questions from I'm just judging it from the past 5 years. Past 5 years means 10 exams, right? So basically that you have to know. And there are also two shift in one exam, so kind of 24 kind of papers are there, right? So that's all, guys. We have done it. And what we have discussed so far, we talked about the dialect, right? And then we talked about so many stuff, right? Beginning with the style, we talked about form, we talked about other like Italian writer, and we talked about talked about some events, we talked about chronology. So basically, you have to remember all these stuff and nothing serious coming from this period. So we'll focus next on Chaucer, and we'll have enough question to, uh, you know, clear that Middle English period. And for the PYQ, you can just click in the comment, in description box, or you can just join the course and you'll get all the notes, whatever the notes we are making, to the point. No other stuff that you should know. You should remember. All these things are well, you know, crafted, to the point, and that will definitely help you in the exam. And if you haven't joined our Telegram channel, you can just go and join from description below. And you can also join WhatsApp group. You can also join our course, buy some printed material based on PYQ, all this stuff. So thank you so much. I'll see you tomorrow on Chaucer. Bye bye and have a great day.